I know you are traveling around China after our talk. What are your expectations, and also what have been your takeaways by talking to the Minister of the Environment and Ecology and also to China's Special Envoy of Climate Change?
So I think the main purpose for us being here is to build on our long-standing partnership with China. We've had a partnership on the area of climate and environment with China for 30 years already. So it's quite a long time, and now we go into a new phase because there are new challenges that we need to tackle together. And we're here to discuss them and also see how our partnership is working in practice.
Norway is well known for its electronic vehicle adoptions. But what does that mean if you see the latest controversies related to electronic vehicles, whether it's tariffs, economic nationalism, industrial policies, and even geopolitics, to you as a Minister of the Environment?
In the green transition that we're going through, there are a lot of possibilities, and I think it's important to highlight those possibilities for people. And one of them is creating new jobs and creating new businesses and creating new possibilities to produce, for example, EVs. And I think it's very understandable that many countries want to be active in that field, and they want to facilitate the new possibilities at home. Sometimes different countries and different businesses are competitors. That's very understandable. But for Norway, it's important that that competition happens in line with the international frameworks, such as the WTO framework, and also in a European context, that it happens in line with the agreements we have, for example, on state aid, on regulations in the European framework.
Your adaptation of electronic vehicles is so high. We all understand it takes a lot of efforts for the infrastructure. You have to have charging stations for people. And in Norway, you also drive a lot. So how to make sure long distance with high speed that people can still use the EVs? All these are pragmatic issues that governments at national and local level, together with other stakeholders, need to figure out. So can you maybe share with us some insights of how your country have managed to nail it?
So I think for EV deployment, first and foremost, and sort of making that market lift up that you need in an initial phase, first and foremost, you need to make sure it's profitable for people to choose an EV. And that's about two things. One is about making it as cheap as possible to choose an EV in itself, but also to ensure that the polluter pays system is utilized in practice, so that you have to pay if you want to choose a fossil-fueled car instead. For the second phase, which is the infrastructure and ensuring that the infrastructure is in place, we have worked a lot with ensuring that we have a network of infrastructure all across the country, making people sure that they can drive to wherever they need to go in Norway without having an anxiety for whether or not they can charge their car or not. So combining those two, and then having people moving forward, demonstrating how an EV car works, making it known in the community that it works very well to drive an EV, that has been an important part for getting to the place where we're in right now in Norway.
Talking about oil and gas, you have been a consistent and reliable supplier of that to the rest of Europe, especially given the recent conflict. And you are continuing that path, but it also creates controversy. For example, people would say, why would you still do that, knowing that there needs to be decarbonization and fossil fuel is not the best for raw materials? So how do you see that controversy? On the one hand, there is pragmatic needs. On the other, that's not the way for the future. So how is Norway, as an oil and gas rich country, weighing on the different aspects of the question?
First and foremost, the important take on how to approach climate and the work that we need to do on emission reductions going forward, I think it is by understanding that the climate crisis, it has to be solved together with other societal challenges that we see. If you solve climate change in a way that does not create new jobs, new opportunities for people, show people the way to prosperity, I think it's very difficult to handle the climate change efforts in practice as well. And that's why the transitioning is so important, and that you have a gradual transitioning over time, a plan on how you're going to transition away from fossil fuels. Now, it is true that we still make some investments in the oil and gas sector in Norway, but we do not make investments to increase production going forward in the medium to long term.
What do you mean by medium and long term?
Post 2030 and also going towards 2050. And we expect a quite rapid decline of Norwegian oil and gas production by 2050, both because many fields are depleted and the resources are being produced, but also because of climate policies in Europe and the active policies to transition away and to change the energy system in Europe. And I think that's a good thing, because that means that as we reduce our production of oil and gas, we also have the opportunities to create jobs in other areas, such as utilizing our competencies to build up an infrastructure for CCS, for example, carbon capture and storage. That can be new opportunities, new jobs, and bring new prosperity to people in Norway.
So how do you articulate, on the one hand, you are still important supplier of oil and gas, fossil fuel, for the rest of Europe, especially given the latest conflict. On the other hand, we know that it's going to be a kind of energy source going to phase out for the future. So how do you evaluate it and see it through a time frame?
I think it is very important for us to follow up the transition away from fossil fuels, and we are working closely with our European partners to do that in practice. Now, towards 2030, towards 2050, we do not expect an increase in production, although there are still some investments in oil and gas production in Norway. We perceive a quite rapid decline towards 2050, both because many fields and resources are depleted, it's a finite resource, but also due to the climate policies and the energy transition that we see going forward. And I think that is a good thing, because that creates also a lot of new opportunities. We can take some of the expertise that we have built with over 50 years of production in Norway and put it into new areas, such as carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, offshore wind, for example, and develop that as new job opportunities, new possibilities for Norwegian businesses, etc.
What about the secrets in that transition?
We've done it, and basically because we created a framework introducing a CO2 tax very early that made it profitable for some of the oil and gas companies to do it. And the advantage of that is that we know that it works, and we can demonstrate that it works. But then the new discussion now is where to put it and how to utilize it in practice. And I think it's important to understand that carbon capture and storage, it's not the solution to everything, but it's an important solution, for example, for some of the hard to abate sectors like cement production or steel production or waste incineration plants. And therefore we've put into place targeted policies for those areas to demonstrate and develop technologies for those areas.
How to make them as less expensive as possible so it can be applied in a much larger scale.
And to do that, first you need to demonstrate it, and that is where we've come quite far already. And then you need to take it to market and take it to scale. And that is the next thing that we need to be able to do. Also discussing how we put into place good frameworks to be able to incentivize the adoption of these technologies. And there I think that the trading scheme for quotas on carbon, both in Europe but also from 2021 here in China, are very important policy instruments to be able to do that.
How do you see a largest developing country like China are articulating and also implementing its earlier commitment about 2030 carbon peak, and also before 2060 carbon neutrality? Even though China is not yet providing a specific timetable, it is obviously implementing those earlier commitments. So after talking to some of your Chinese colleagues, what is your assessment of the latest process?
Obviously, one of the biggest things globally happening on the energy transition right now is all the renewable power generation that is being deployed here in China. And that is a crucial part of the transition that we're talking about, putting into place renewable power production instead of fossil-based power production, and something that we need to speed up everywhere else in the world as well to be able to achieve our common targets. But I think a lot of places in the world, or most of the places in the world, it's not like in Norway where we've been blessed with a lot of hydropower. We have many mountains and much rain, so it's been efficient to build a hydropower-based power system, which means that we have a renewable system already today. But most places in the world, it's not like that. It's a lot of fossil fuels, and for good historical reasons. We can explain from a technical point of view, for example, and an economic point of view, why those systems have been built. But that is why it's so important to work actively with the transition away from part that we're into now. Because the energy sector is our biggest challenge on climate globally. So everywhere we need to see fossil fuels being replaced by something else, and that something else is to a large extent the renewable power generation that we need to see. We see that happening here in China, we see it happening in many places in the world, but we need to speed up those processes, ensuring that it happens even faster than what is happening today.
One of the challenges for climate change discussions is the differences between the so-called North and the South. We see commitments being made by developed economies over the years at different COPs to provide fund for developing economies. Meanwhile, we also see that commitments being made to provide fund and financial support for those economies that are helping the rest of the world to nurture the ecosystem. For example, in Brazil, the Amazon is an important example of that. So how do you see the complaints now, to say the least, from developing countries that those money is not there, even though commitments have been made?
I'm of the strong belief that we cannot solve the challenges that we have ahead of us unless we get everyone on board. So we have to work very hard to ensure that also the Global South, for example, can develop, can utilize the new sources of renewable electricity generation to create jobs and opportunities in their countries, creating prosperity for people. And climate finance is crucial if we are to get that right. And some of that absolutely must be public money and governments putting up money. Some of it has to be sort of good structures that the governments can create, allowing private money to come in as well.
PPP.
And I think one of the areas where it will be important to have good discussions going forward is how we can align the international financial system in a way that ensure that also businesses, when making their decisions, no matter whether it's in the south or in the northern parts of the world, align their business decisions and their investment decision with the 1.5 target.
What do you think might be the incentive for business to do that? Do you have any proposals?
Norway has for a very long time been vocal about the fact that CO2 pricing is extremely important, because emissions of CO2 is an externality cost that businesses does not necessarily take into account when making their decisions. So that is one possible way to do it, but there are many others, and it's not necessarily such that one size fits all, but it's very important that all find good measures to ensure that we can align the financial flows globally with the 1.5 target and what we're trying to do on the transition globally.
I am empathetic to all the ministers of environment and also climate change, because their predecessors might not have to face the challenges that they are facing right now, which is more economic nationalism plus geopolitics. And we know that is going to be reflected in negotiations everywhere on issues related to environment and climate change. As the minister from Norway, how are you articulating the realities and try to come up with the best possibilities?
Let's first remember why we are working on this. I mean, for Norway, our ambition is to become a low-emission society by 2050. It means that we need to cut 90 to 95% of our 1990 emissions. That's a lot. And 26 years, it might seem to be a long time, but when you think about how long many investment decisions are going to live in practice, if you invest in a new business, or if you invest in a new road, for example, that is going to have a lifespan of much more than 26 years. So we have to internalize the thinking already now. I'm not the oldest Minister of Climate and Environment in the world, but just to put it into perspective, in 2050 I'll be 58 years old, and I very much plan to be around still when I'm 58. So we're doing this because we need to do it for ourselves, for the world that we want to be live in the future. Then luckily, although we have a lot of work left and that we need higher ambitions and more finance and speeding up the transition, there is happening a lot on cooperation in this field.
How do you see China and Norway can work together leading up to COP29 and also implementation of Kunming-Montreal framework?
So we have been, as I've mentioned earlier, working together for many years already, demonstrating how this can be done, sharing our common expertise, for example, in many of these areas. And I think the new works that we have initiated while I've been here now in China on plastics and methane is concrete examples of how we can step forward as well. China is the biggest plastic producer in the world, so what is happening here in the plastic value chain is extremely important, and you have a lot of knowledge in the field as well. And then we have, of course, much experience, for example, on plastic waste management and how to implement that in practice. So I think we have many areas where we can share our common experiences and utilize that towards the negotiations that we want to see and need to see going forward.
Mr. Minister, what a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much for sharing your time.
Thank you so much for having me.